give a very warm welcome to Governor Angus King.
How are you? Thank you. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and therefore we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. That's Abraham Lincoln, December 2nd, 1862, in the midst of the Civil War. That's all you need to know about risk and creativity. Lincoln once said that every political thought he had arose from the Declaration of Independence. Practically every thought I've ever had arose from Abraham Lincoln. Let's talk about risk, creativity, and the group. Those are the three things. The first thing is risk. Did you ever stop and think that there's a multi-million-dollar industry in this country that puts erasers on pencils? That means it's okay to make mistakes. People expect you to make mistakes. If you don't make mistakes, you're not doing anything. Okay? Dustin Pedroia makes an out 2 out of every 3 times he goes to bat. Wayne Gretzky once said, and this is a pretty profound piece of advice, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Risk is the only thing that allows you to get anywhere. And I can think of 2 times in my life where I took some pretty significant risks and lead over into a little bit of discussion of creativity. The first was the creation of my business in 1989. I was sitting at a board meeting. Our company essentially was going out of business because we were in the hydropower business. And by the way, I remember going to hydro hearings in Maine on behalf of projects and have people yell at me, "You're ruining our rivers." You know what then they said? "Why don't you build windmills?" Which I'm now doing, and they're yelling at me to go back to hydro. Which proves Mort Saul's famous statement that if you maintain a consistent political opinion in this country long enough, you will eventually be tried for treason. So anyway, our company was going out of business because the price that was being paid for electricity was not high enough to support the construction of hydro projects. And I had this idea. I was sitting at the table, and I had this idea. And I had read an article 5 or 6 years before by a guy named Amory Lovins. And Amory Lovins said the cost of installing conservation of electricity is a lot lower than the cost of building new generation. So I was sitting there and I said, well, we can't sell our hydropower because the price is too low. Maybe we can sell conservation because it costs half as much. But I remember, I'm not making this up, I remember sitting at the table and having this thought, these guys were all sitting around, and saying to myself, but if I say this, they'll think I'm stupid. And by the way, the biggest impediment to creativity and accomplishment is the little man that sits on your shoulder and says, "You can't do that. They'll think you're stupid." Fortunately, I took a deep breath and said, why don't we go into the conservation business instead of the generation business? We can sell the conservation for 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 6 or 7 cents. Everybody wins because the utility doesn't have to buy expensive new generation. We're saving electricity and all those things. And of course they said, that's a crazy idea. Flash forward 6 or 8 months, but they did pat me on the head and say, Angus, it's a crazy idea, but why don't you look into it? So I worked on it for 6 or 8 months. Go flash forward to the Christmas party of my company in December of 1988, where the company went from 40 people to 4. At the Christmas party. We were called in one at a time and laid off. It was one of the most bizarre days of my life. they said to me, so what do you want to do, Angus? What's your package? I said, well, give me a little, I've got a contract here, give me half my contract salary and the rights to this wacky conservation idea. They said, fine. A week later, I formed a company, Northeast Energy Management. A couple of weeks after that, I signed a contract with Central Maine Power to develop conservation alternatives throughout Maine, or South Central Maine. And over the next 5 years, built a company that had a substantial set of revenues on a new idea. The idea, and this is the important thing about creativity. Creativity is not the invention of something that never, that is just absolutely new in the world. Nothing is new in the world. Everything has happened before. Mark Twain said, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. Isn't that a great line? History doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. So creativity isn't coming up with something brand new. Creativity is putting things together in a way that people haven't thought of before. For example, this is something everybody in this audience has seen. What is a bicycle seat? Millions of people have seen bicycle seats, handlebars for a bicycle. One guy in the 1930s looked at these two things and thought of putting them together in a way that nobody had done before. And here's what he did. It's a bull. You see it? You know who the guy was? Picasso. Pablo Picasso. And he didn't invent the handlebar or the bicycle seat. What he invented was the way to put them together. And that's what creativity is all about. I didn't invent energy conservation, and I didn't invent selling power to the utilities. My concept, my idea was put those two things together in a new way. Okay, risk. The next part of the story, of course, is borrowing a huge amount of money. And I remember going to bed every night for about a year and a half with these steel bands, it felt like, around my chest because I'd borrowed so much money. I was so glad my father wasn't alive because knowing that I'd borrowed $6.5 million would have killed him. The end of the story, of course, is I sold the business in 1994 for a shitload of money. That's a technical term. And it changed my life. That's a technical term. It's a financial term. It's a Wall Street term. Okay, 1994, I'm thinking about the possibility of running for governor. What a crazy idea. There were 13 other candidates. I was thinking of running as an independent. I had never run for public office before. The leading candidate in the race was a guy who shall remain nameless, Joe Brennan, who had been governor twice, congressman twice, attorney general, state senator, had name recognition at that point of 94%. I took a poll when I was thinking about running for governor. You know what my name recognition was? By the way, after 15 years on public broadcasting, 9%. I think it was 11. K-Rand says it was 9, but it was not very high. In other words, a stupid thing to do. But I remember the moment that we made the decision, and I say we because it was a family decision. We made the decision to do this thing. And it was based explicitly upon the most important and profound piece of advice I ever got in my life. The piece of advice came from an old New Hampshireman when I was in my early 20s. And here's what he said. When you get to be my age, you're going to regret things about your life. See that you regret the things you did and not the things you didn't do. Isn't that profound? And so we're sitting there at dinner and we're talking about this, and it's going to be expensive and it's going to be emotionally toll. It's a lot of effort and no sleep and strain on the family and privacy and all these kinds of things. And then my son Duncan, who had heard me, give this advice, was 19 years old. He said, "Dad, you got to do it." I said, "How come?" He said, "Well, because it's what you always said." He said, "When you're 75 or 80 and you look back and things have gotten worse and you will never forgive yourself if you didn't try." And of course he was right. It was the trying that was important. Winning was good, but it was the trying that was important. And that's really what I think we have to continue to think about. And the final thing I want to talk about is the group. and creativity and risk within the group. I do this thing when I teach. In fact, I did it with about 150 people in Portland earlier this week. It's an exercise of you're stranded on the moon, and you have 15 items that you can salvage from your ship, and you have to get 200 miles to the mothership across the moon. And the thing is, you rank these things according to what's most important: box of matches, oxygen tank, compressed food, inflatable raft, all these 15 items. So everybody in the audience, I could do it right now, everybody fills out and they put 1 through 15. What is the most important? What is the least important? By the way, the least important is the matches. There's no atmosphere on the moon. 1 through 15. Then you break the audience, the group, up into groups of 5 or 6 people. They do the same thing again. They go through the same exercise, and they argue about, oh, no, I think this should be number 6 and this should be number 7. And they come up with their list. And then I give the answers, which came from NASA. The right answers, 1 through 15. And then you subtract the one from the other. I've now administered this to about 600 or 700 people. The average is 2 to 3% of the individuals beat the group. The group, the 5 or 6 people doing it together, non-experts, always do better than any one person. And that's pretty important. So the question then is, how do you get the best from the group? And this is where you get to risk and creativity. Creativity involves risk. By definition, you're doing something new. There's risk. It's inherent in it. The two words are together. Therefore, you've got to create an atmosphere in your team of comfort and safety. The sociological term is the psychological safety of the group. You've got to create a situation where people in the group aren't afraid to ask a stupid question, to have a stupid idea, that they aren't going to be ostracized or laughed at or pushed out. What you want is to wring the last ounce of creativity out of your group, the last ounce of wisdom. And you're not going to get that, you all have had this experience, you're not going to get that if you're worried, if you're uncomfortable, if you don't feel safe. And this is the way to really harness the power of people's wisdom and creativity. You've got to create, and you've got to create it explicitly. The higher up you are in the hierarchy of your organization, the more intimidating you are. The more intimidating you are, just naturally. So you've got to say, it's okay to be stupid. It's okay. I want all the ideas. If you watch a wonderful film called 13 Days about Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's a time in that group, the XCOM, where Bobby Kennedy turns around and says to McNamara, Bob, give me anything. Give me anything. I don't care how crazy. And McNamara sort of hems and haws and says, well, we did have this idea about a blockade. Well, that ended up being the key to the solution to the whole problem. If it had been a stiff, formal meeting where people were worried, that idea probably never would have gotten on the table. So risk and creativity are inherent. And I'll leave you with this thought. Mary says, I say finally too much. It gets people's hopes up. The Chinese symbol for crisis, and we're in a tough situation now. For many people, it is a crisis. The Chinese symbol for crisis is 2 symbols, as often is the case with Chinese words. They're little symbols, and there's basically 2 words put together that creates the word crisis. You ask a Chinese person, what does that mean? Crisis. The interesting thing is, what are the 2 words that they use to create this word crisis? The 2 words are danger, makes sense, right? The other is opportunity. Isn't that cool? Danger and opportunity. That's what a crisis is. So it gives you an opportunity for creativity. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and therefore we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. And then here's the key phrase: we must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Thank you.